It's 2007 at the last round of the Indoor Trials World Championship. An up-and-comer named Toni Bou is about to start his run. This had been his first year as an official Montesa rider, and there was no pressure on his shoulders, no expectations. As he reached the end of the final section, Toni had done it. He managed to win the World Championship.
Última actuación para el campeón del mundo, Toni Bou.
It was an amazing feat, one of the youngest contenders to ever do so. Little did people know back then, this would mark the beginning of a new page in the history books. Ever since that night in 2007, nobody else managed to win the championship.
36 consecutive titles later, Toni Bou left a legacy of a man who, up to this day, has been utterly unbeatable. He pushed for injuries and setbacks, but nothing and nobody could get him.
So, where did this all begin? And how? The story of Toni Bou isn't as straightforward as it might seem, but it does show what it takes to be the most successful motorcycle rider of all time. Born on the 17th of October 1986, Toni quickly grew to admire his dad's motorcycle. He kept pleading to his parents, and not that much later, at just 4 years of age, he got his first little bike.
Bueno, mi primer recuerdo de una motocicleta es muy especial, ya que fue el día de mi cuarto aniversario, 4 añitos, y mi padre me regaló una Aprilia de mini trial, y bueno, pues es un momento para mí inexplicable que no voy a olvidar nunca.
Around the same time, Toni also got pretty deep into riding his trials bicycle. And just 2 years later, the Spaniard made the choice and completely abandoned the engine side of the sport.
At that time, Toni was better at bicycle trials, so it made sense as a kid to focus more on that part. But, you know, perspectives change, especially when you're a little kiddo, and by the time he was 12, Toni got to enjoy the motorbikes more and more.
His father kept riding with him as a youngster, and the man also became Toni's biggest inspiration. For a couple years, Toni juggled both sports in parallel, until finally deciding to stick with motorcycle trials. But without knowing his current career, the start wasn't as dominating as one might expect.
Sure, at 12 he did win the Catalan Cadet Trials Championship, but when it comes to the global stage, that wasn't a quick progression.
In 2003, Toni debuted in the World Trials Championships, and he only ended up 13th in the standings. In fact, it took him 3 full years to be able to get the final taste of a stage win. It was a hard-fought win, but Toni could finally join the top step of the podium. This little win and his overall 2006 performance made Montesa aware of Toni, and they signed him up as an official rider for the 2007 Trials Championships. Back then, Toni was riding a 2-stroke Beta, and despite his win, he only managed to finish 5th overall.
Don't get me wrong, that's nothing to scoff at, but also not groundbreaking. What this did show was his consistency. He was relentless, every single year pushing to better himself.
The expectations for the 2007 season were low. Montesa had no pressure put on Toni's shoulders. It was a bit of an experiment. But with that freedom, Toni managed to kickstart the longest winning streak in the two-wheeled world. He secured the win on 4 of the 8 Indoor Trials World events, while riding a new bike for him, the 4-stroke Montesa, which is a motorcycle that people didn't have much hope for back in the day. Now, to give you an idea on just how dominant this man has been, in 2007, he was the second youngest winner of the Trials Indoor World Championship. That year, he also won the Outdoor Championship. And ever since, he has won every single indoor and outdoor world competition. And that's not because he had no rivals, quite the opposite. He just became that good.
With 36 world titles next to his name as of today, Toni is, technically speaking, by far the most successful motorcycle rider in history, And just to remind you, he's still competing.
For reference, two of the most legendary trials riders, Dougie Lampkin and Jordi Tares, both have less than half of Toni's titles. Even if trials only hosted one championship every year, Toni would still have 18 in a row.
In 2009, he managed to score a perfect season, winning both World Championships, both Spanish Championships, and the Trials of Nations.
This is a feat that had only been achieved once by his main rival, Adam Raga. In 2019, he managed to win every single event of the Indoor World Championship, and even more outstanding, up till 2023, Toni managed to get himself on the podium for a total of 221 events. Out of those, more than 76% were wins. And this stat includes his career before he managed to take his first title. That's just unheard of. For people who aren't familiar with the sport, it might be easy to attribute some of his success to the Montesa bike he was riding. In fact, his main career is deeply tied to that Honda-based machine. But the real story is not that simple. You see, in the early 2000s, Montesa was still using two-strokes built by HRC, Honda's racing corporation. As Honda's perspective on two-strokes was changing, as we all know, they decided to pivot the Trials bike engines too and switch over to four-strokes. For better or for worse, in 2004, Montesa came out with their first ever Thumper Trials machine.
And let's just say, people weren't that impressed. Sure, Dougie Lampkin and Fujinami did have some early success on this platform, but not enough to convince the majority that this was the right way forward.
And that all changed in 2007, when Toni Bou came into the mix and showed everyone that their unique four-stroke could in fact dominate the world of trials. But this was not any ordinary Montesa four-stroke. Tomoyuki Ogawa, Montesa development rider, worked intensively with Toni to bring their bike to a winning standard. They developed his motorcycle to such a point where his factory machine looked nothing like the standard offering. And that's in pretty stark contrast to, let's say, the machines used by hard enduro riders these days.
This following info is from an Italian Trials Facebook group by a guy who allegedly spoke to Toni in depth about his bike, so take it with a small grain of salt. But
apparently, his bike isn't as light as some would imagine. What is much heavier is the flywheel, and this allowed them to mount more magnets than normal and increase the engine braking characteristics significantly. This also allowed them to develop a 2 spark plug setup, and that was a game changer. With this discovery, they managed to control the plugs independently, and thus alter the engine response depending on the obstacles Toni was facing.
now, at the time, this technology was finicky, so only a handful of people from Japan knew how to adjust these timing systems. Honda also made sure to add fuel injection to this bike, which made power delivery more consistent when the bike was sitting at extreme angles.
Fully custom forks and shocks were also added, since his Trials bike had to feature a soft suspension setup, while also being able to absorb the huge hits you get in Trials when coming down from sky-high obstacles. The slightly sad part is, from my understanding, Montesa worked really hard in constantly updating Toni's bike, but apparently these changes didn't reflect that much on their public offering. A bit sad, but the takeaway point is, Toni tried to improve anything he could, not just his riding, but also his machine. That Montesa became an extension of his limbs, allowing the Spaniard to do unimaginable things. At the same time, you could argue Toni didn't really invent anything in the sport, which might sound counterintuitive. In fact, this was the gist of his career. He took the techniques that already existed and simply developed them to almost perfection. He pushed them forwards, things like back wheel turns, taking them from a novelty to an almost art form. Same with tackling high steps. Toni didn't invent that, but he kept pushing the boundaries, and those steps became taller and taller.
One of his key advantages was his background in bicycle trials. By doing that side of the sport, Toni got used to maneuvering his bike using the least amount of engine input as possible, using his body more than anything.
And this translated extremely well to motorcycles, allowing him to use minimal revs in order to traverse the complicated obstacle courses. A question that seems to arise often is, how far can he go? What's the limit of the sport? And while I guess we'll never fully know, Toni himself did say that his riding skill is almost at 100%. But with knowing that, he's been trying to develop his bike more and more over the years to manage to extract more performance out of something.
And I love how self-aware that perspective is, but also his determination to get better at it one way or another, even after all these years of domination.
And this is where it all comes from. It's in his mentality. In fact, not just once did Toni say that his biggest critic is himself. I mean, in the 2022 season, despite winning both world championships, he only graded himself as a 7 or 8 out of 10. In fact, getting to the top level is one thing, but staying there is another. You need a certain level of selfishness. In his own words, at that point, improving can actually get tricky. A lot of the time, as soon as he started getting better in one aspect, it would compromise other parts of his riding. It was a really delicate balance to maintain, because a lot of times when he tried to get better, he would become worse overall.
For me, as an average rider, it's quite hard to comprehend, but this just shows the difference in levels between the masters and, well, us.
But in his mentality also lies his biggest advantage. He's aggressive. An aggressiveness inherited from his bicycle trials background. It's what made him push the sport more and more. He's a man who takes a lot of risks, and many times he has to talk himself down in practice sessions. In fact, that's one of his biggest fears. Getting injured because he couldn't control himself. Because he went too far.
Sobre todo las lesiones, ¿no? Es una cosa que yo arriesgo mucho, tengo un pilotaje muy arriesgado y que no me sé controlar en los momentos y es una cosa que a veces pienso que hay que vigilar un poco.
And you can see where this is coming from. Toni's career wasn't all smooth sailing. He encountered plenty of setbacks. In 2016, he crashed during training and severely injured his shoulder.
Short while later, Toni still won the Spanish stage of the Trials GP, but not with ease. In fact, Adam Raga had to replace Toni in that year's Trials of Nations Cup.
Just 2 years later, Toni crashed again during competition and hit his back against a concrete obstacle, fracturing 3 vertebrae in the process.
¿Estás bien? ¿Estás bien?
He had to retire from that race, yet somehow he pushed through and still came out on top that season. This is not just a story of dominance, this is one of resilience. And then there were his rivals. He got to compete with some of the biggest names in the sport, from Lampkin to Fujinami and Adam Raga. People who, by themselves, have become legends of trials. And according to Toni, the competition is only getting stronger, as nowadays anyone from the top 5 has a chance of winning. It was never easy for him, and more importantly, it never got any easier.
This is where I didn't quite understand it. Okay, you get to the top, you stay there for a bunch of years, but what can possibly keep one so motivated to keep on doing the same thing over and over to perfection?
You've achieved everything, broken all records, why bother? This is a type of motivation that I don't think I'll ever have, and it is what sets a true champion apart from the rest. But deep down, the answer is really simple for Toni. He just loves riding motorcycles. Simple as that. His main goal isn't to win everything, it's to keep enjoying himself every time he steps foot over a bike. Even up to this day, riding a bike is still a way for Toni to disconnect.
In a way, his reason is so similar to ours. He just took that a few steps further.
And when you truly love every single ride, training stops being a chore. He gets to enjoy every single outing. And that's not easy once the sport becomes your job. Plus, this passion made him a proper ambassador over the years. For a long time, Toni had been pushing for changes in regulations in order to make trials more accessible, more fun to watch, better for everyone. He's been lobbying the FIM to change outdated rules that tend to ruin parts of the sport. This is a man who's in it for the overall good, not just for himself. Now, he did say in an interview that there are 2 main ways he stays on top of things. For one, he's in constant competition with himself. That's the main factor behind his drive.
La primera, aunque parezca que no, tiene que ser mejorar mi pilotaje, trabajar el día a día, porque es el camino que hay que seguir para ser campeón del mundo y para ser competitivo el fin de semana.
And second, it's an internal hunger of winning more and more, almost like an addiction, beating legend after legend, record after record.
Luego la motivación tiene que ser, evidentemente, pues querer ganar más cosas, querer tener más títulos, querer ganar más carreras, fijarte en las leyendas, ¿no? Lo que han conseguido para...
But in my opinion, the first one of those is crucial, because at this point in his career, there are no more legends to beat. Nobody else to aspire towards. You are the best of all time. And that makes his determination even more impressive.
What would also be impressive is you clicking that subscribe button. Cheers! While he made his name in trials, it's no secret that Toni had wanted to try other facets of the sport, even though he might not be as good at them. He loves motocross, hard enduro, even adventure bikes when he did a full series with the Africa Twin. Maybe there is an upcoming video on how this type of collabs changed the adventure world. Just saying. The problem is, the same mentality that brought him to the top step in trials is hindering him from transitioning.
Pero está claro que si tendría que decir ahora una disciplina, el enduro extremo, el hard enduro...
He always goes all out, and what that results in is a lot of crashes and injuries whenever he transitions to an enduro bike. And I'm not saying that, he is.
Que me encantaría probarme, pero como también te he dicho antes, ¿no? Voy muy al límite, también tengo que decir que las veces que lo he probado siempre acabo pillando y así que el equipo pues me frena bastante.
With that being said, I think I can speak for all of us that we'd love to see Toni Bou have a run at it in Extreme Enduro. Maybe that will be our retirement gift once he finally decides to let others have some glory in trials.
And we're back to current days. Toni extended his contract with HRC till 2027, so we still have 3 more years of possible Bou domination. Even saying that feels crazy, to be honest. What's clear is this. Toni Bou marked a new era in trials. And not just that. His run is the most successful one motorsport has ever seen.
And if you ask me, I rarely say this, but this might actually be a record that will never be beaten. I honestly don't see that happening. It's that good.
This is not a generational talent. It's way beyond that at this point. And all I can say is, we should feel privileged to live at the same time when this part of history is being written. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.